Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today with our program with Mitchell Plitnick. We're here today to talk about the book he's written along with his co-author, Marc Lamont Hill, called Except for Palestine. It's called Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics by Mitchell Plitnick and Marc Lamont Hill. So we're really excited for this talk tonight. Mitchell is the current president of a group called ReThinking Foreign Policy. He was previously the co-director of Jewish Voice for Peace and the director of the U.S. Office of Belton. So he has a lot of experience and knowledge about this field. This event, of course, is sponsored by Massachusetts Peace Action. We're a nonprofit grassroots organization wanting to build a more peaceful world, society. We want US foreign policy to be focused more on peace and diplomacy and less on militarism. We're very concerned about the situation in Palestine and Israel. We have a Palestine-Israel working group that studies and focuses on these issues, and we lobby Congress to be more fair in the US's treatment or the US's position in regards to Palestine and Israel. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Mitchell, so much for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for coming, showing up and being here.
Great. So to get us started, can you kind of lay out for us exactly what is this concept of progressive except for Palestine? What drove you to write this book? And then also talk to us a little bit about like why does this happen? Why is there this phenomenon of progressive except for Palestine in the U.S. among like some Democrats and progressives and others?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a number of levels to really start at the beginning. I mean, we came to this question of Marc and I wanting to write a book and wanting to do something that was impactful and a little bit different from what other writers and scholars had done on this. As I'm sure you all know, there are many, many books on this issue. And we were also trying to think about, you know, at the present moment, how can we as, you know, scholars on this issue, as public intellectuals, how can we make a difference in what we're doing? So we wanted to look at, we decided that we would look at this sort of dynamic of, you know, a political liberalism that seems to be liberal on so many other issues, but not on this one. And it's less of, the book itself actually goes into less of why that might be, just as much as just sort of trying to point out the fact that it is, and to hold a mirror up to people to say, look, you have a certain set of values, and you know, I think many of us share those values, and yet on this issue, those values are not apparent. So what we did was we looked at a few different aspects of the question of Israel-Palestine, and you know, sort of developed arguments as to why American policy, if we were actually following a sort of more liberal-minded policy, would be different from what it is in, you know, what it is in reality. And I think part of that also involves needing to be realistic about what American policy is and can be in the context of American foreign policy more generally. So we're not trying to say that that American policy on Israel and Palestine should somehow be exceptional in the other direction. We are, you know, I think we are very realistic about the fact that American foreign policy in general leaves quite a bit to be desired, to say the least. And yet, what we noticed, well, we start the book by talking about the incident of during the Trump administration of people coming up from Latin America, and the immigrants coming to the border being stopped, and the Trump xenophobia, and how many Americans, not just people who were on the radical left, but many very mainstream liberal Americans reacted to that. And to particularly, so for example, when Trump said that troops could use live fire if if people seeking asylum should throw anything at them. That was something that many people here greeted with outrage. If we were detaining children, that caused demonstrations all across the country. Yet only a few weeks later, that same administration decided to cut funds to the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, that provides basic services to Palestinian refugees. And we didn't, the money was, in terms of the US budget, virtually nothing, but it was crucial to UNRWA's functioning, and UNRWA's been in crisis ever since. And this action generated very little controversy. So we sort of contrasted those two things, allowing for the fact that there's some clear differences, right? In terms of how how each impacts Americans on the ground, but even so, just on the very ethical level, that the latter, the undercut went, just caused very little controversy at all. No one even seemed to notice. So, that sort of thing we just sort of held up to people. As to why this happens, I mean, I think that is a long story. And again, as I mentioned, it's not something that we go into in the book. For me, it's a very different question as to why this happens. But I would have to say that, but again, depends whether we're talking about what US policy is or how people view the conflict. So in terms of policies, about, I think 6 or 7 years ago, I wrote a fairly in-depth piece for the Middle East Research and Information Project, and explored the question of how US policy towards Israel-Palestine came to be. Historically, it was based on geostrategic interests. And, unfortunately, most US policy is based on perceived interests that are not necessarily, I would say, in the best interest of anyone, that have very little to do with human rights and ethical concerns. And indeed, that is the case also with Israel and with Palestine. So, and then on the more public level, the level of public opinion, I mean, that is the question of how Israel is perceived and how the Palestinians and the Arab world in general are perceived. This goes into questions that have, issues that have been building up for decades upon decades of, and involve many different factors. I think fundamentally, Israel has always been an ally to the United States, and I think most people see it in a very positive light. Whereas I think there is a great deal of anti-Arab racism in this country. I think there have been tensions between Americans and Arab leaders in the past, and we're going back decades to things like the oil embargo. And I just think that there is that has allowed for the building of a certain perception of the events on the ground in Israel, Palestine, that are coupled with the fact that people in this country tend not to really have great access to the facts, unless they really want to go out and find them. And I think a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions as to what happens on the ground there. So different aspects, but in our book, we're really looking at policy. And I think the question of policy is one that is based on geostrategic interests. If we're looking at Congress, there is certainly a question of lobbies that influence Congress, and that do an effective job of pleading their case on one side and a less effective job of pleading their case on the other. So there are a number of factors there, but I think the why of it is certainly not unimportant. But I think the key right now is to is to is for people to realize that there is something here that, from a liberal perspective, apart from normal U.S. policy, but from a liberal perspective, is something that how should I say, it is it's an outlier. It is something where our values seem to be applied in a different way, where liberal people can object to actions in other places, but somehow there is this exception when it comes to the question of Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so I think you said a lot of interesting things there. Um, for a long time, like my whole life, basically, I think people have been saying, "Oh, like don't touch the issue of Palestine in politics. That's like a career ender for a politician." And but I think especially among the younger generation, from what I'm seeing at least, it seems to me that a lot of people are, at least in like the Democratic base or like the kind of the left side of the political spectrum, a lot of them are starting to acknowledge this dynamic that you're talking about, like this kind of unfair treatment of the Palestinian people, the occupation that's happening. And especially with a lot of young people, I see them not being like afraid to talk about this issue and wanting to do it. And I think some of that, this whole notion of like Palestinian people like also being human beings like everyone else, I think it's starting to be reflected in Congress a little bit, maybe with like one or two members of Congress or three or four here or there. So, I mean, my question for you is like, do you see that as well? Like, are things changing in Congress? Is there more willingness to speak up for Palestinian human rights or speak out against the occupation? What do you think about that?
Um, I, I think that yes, there has been a shift, at least in really in both parties. I mean, one of the things that I think people, you know, in 2021 might find hard to believe is that if you go back a few decades, actually, the questioning of our policy towards Israel Palestine, most of that actually came from Republicans and from conservative Republicans, in fact, who in the olden days before. That group of people was characterized by a certain religious fervor on this issue, um, tended to be very much foreign policy realists and tended to look at everything in terms of interests and question whether or not our one-sided support of Israel was really the best thing for the United States. Um, in the Democratic Party, what you have in the past few years is, I think, a growing sense that something is wrong, that there is a problem with denying Palestinian rights for so many decades. And I think the key thing is that people are starting to realize that it's happening. And I think people did not know that. Now, you know, I myself, I grew up in the late 70s and through the 1980s. And that was, to me, when the first profound shift happened in the attitudes of most Americans. When I was growing up, uh, in mainstream news reports, and remember this is pre-internet, um, the word Palestinian was almost uniformly followed by the word terrorist. We never really heard much of the stories of Palestinians living under occupation. Occasionally there was a story in the news, but it was rare. Um, in 1987, when the first Intifada came about, that started to change, and you started to hear stories more often about about life in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as inside Israel for Palestinians. Around that time, you also had some Israeli historians who were breaking with the more traditional narrative. They were called the New Historians, and started putting out different versions of of history that had been, well known, I think, to many um, in Israel and Palestine, but not so much in the United States. So you have that sort of evolution, and by now I'm going to jump. There's a lot of history there. I'm going to just jump over, but by now you do have people in Congress that are willing to speak out to some degree on the question of Israel-Palestine, but it's still very, very hard. You can look at the backlash that Ilhan Omar has gotten, for example. On the other hand, you can also look at the fact that in 2016, and I think this was very significant, as Bernie Sanders was campaigning in Brooklyn, of all places, he was willing to be critical of Israel and say that we should not always agree with Netanyahu, and that there are problems with the way Israel is treating Gaza. And he was willing to say that. And it is true on the one hand that Bernie didn't win the nomination in 2016, but it's also true that nobody makes the case that his stance on Israel and Palestine was a contributing factor to that. And it wasn't. I mean, you can see by the polls, he lost nothing. And he got quite an ovation, actually, when he did say it at his rally. So we've seen more of this, but it is still a very, very one-sided situation in Washington. And I don't think we can water that down. I don't think we can afford to minimize that point. It is still very difficult to sustain criticism of Israel. I think you can see right now with the question of the International Criminal Court, and that investigation that has started, there's very little pushback against the Biden administration, which is completely agreeing with the Trump administration in their, passionate opposition to the ICC taking action and investigating Israel. Biden has done nothing to reverse the sanctions that were placed on ICC officials by Trump. There's a lot of things that Trump did that Biden has taken no action to reverse. And that is not surprising. I don't think anyone expected anything different from Biden, but nobody's really pushing him to do that. And that's now. One of the reasons that we are even here, while there is more of an awareness among Democrats, a lot of that is because Israel's actions in the past decade and a half have been much more draconian. And people have seen them. The attacks, the several attacks on Gaza were reaching American screens. They were reaching through, whether through YouTube or through mainstream news or whatever. People were seeing what was happening and were saying, this is not okay. So there is a shift, but there is a very, very long way to go. And in terms of policy, there are real problems. The split, for example, in the Palestinian leadership is a real problem because it doesn't give American politicians anything to really support in the West Bank and Gaza. So it's a mixed bag, but yes, there is something to build on, I would say.
Yeah, those attacks in Gaza, like specifically the one in 2014, that's what got me interested in this issue. Seeing all those images and videos, that was a very sad time. Can you talk a little bit about the role of the media in all of this? I remember in that 2014 attack against Gaza, even Joe Scarborough was saying on his show that this isn't okay. And it did seem to me at that time that there was more media coverage about this. But then your own co-author for this book, he got fired from CNN for basically speaking up for the Palestinian people. Another recent incident, I think, was Nathan Robinson. The Congress, they passed some sort of COVID relief bill, I think, and they allocated some money to go to Israel. And he made a joke saying that, saying something about, oh, every time the US Congress passes a law, they have to send money to Israel. And then he clarified, like, hey, this is a joke. And he got fired from The Guardian for that. So can you talk about that a little bit, the culture of the media institutions when it comes to this conflict?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this was when Marc got fired from CNN, it was something that that became even more personal to me than it had been before. I've experienced some professional setbacks because of my positions, and I've known many other people who have encountered similar problems. And unfortunately, it's nothing new. The problem that we face in speaking out for Palestinian rights is that that entire concept has been conflated with anti-Semitism and hopelessly intertwined with it. And it is, I think, really important that that be entangled. And there are some of us who are working to do just that, to try and disentangle it. But it's a very effective sort of ploy. Nobody wants to be called an anti-Semite. It's in the United States, it's one of the worst kinds of bigotry you can be accused of because of its history, and I think also because in the U.S. there's a sort of combination of self-righteousness and shame around anti-Semitism, where the most recent, and vivid example, obviously, of anti-Semitism is the Holocaust. And so on the one hand, that happened in Europe, not here. On the other hand, the United States, closed its borders and would not allow Jewish refugees in. So I think it touches a nerve in the United States, just as it does in Europe. And these are the key sites of these sort of ideological battles. So that is something that that needs to be disentangled. The notion that criticism of Israel is rooted in anti-Semitism. I mean, I certainly have seen critics of Israel who were in fact anti-Semitic. It's not common. It's not nearly as common as pro-Israel forces would like to make you think, but it happens. It's like it does with, you find bigotries in all sorts of progressive movements and among individuals who hold all sorts of beliefs. That's, we can look at the left and see, we can see racism, we can see sexism, we can see homophobia, transphobia, all sorts of things. People who are on the left or progressive are not immune to those faults. That being said, most criticism of Israel is just that, and it's criticism of Israel. But the fact is that people are easily cowed by this accusation of anti-Semitism, and there's a lot of momentum behind that tactic of of labeling all criticism of Israel anti-Semitic. So it is hard. It's hard to do. At the same time, a lot of this is a sort of fear of what might happen if you get called this. And as we've seen, again, going back to the example of Bernie Sanders, he made his statement, and moved right along. Ilhan Omar gets called an anti-Semite, it's true, but most people aren't buying it. She's still in Congress. Nobody, there's the forces that, call for her ouster are transparently self-interested, and everybody can see it. It hasn't really threatened her position. It hasn't threatened Rashida Tlaib's position. But people are still very scared. It's a powerful tool, and being Jewish is not certainly not a shield against it. I've been called an anti-Semite more times than I can count, even though I've been confronted with actual anti-Semitism on many occasions, especially when I was younger and lived as an Orthodox Jew. So all of that is a very real thing, and it's a very difficult thing to overcome, but it's something that has to be overcome, and it has to be confronted. So the difficulties in speaking out, there's difficulties in speaking out on lots of issues, and if we don't do it, then the situation is certainly not going to change.
Right. So when some people speak out, for example, Ilhan Omar or Bernie Sanders, as you mentioned, in the case of Ilhan Omar, like she won her re-election like overwhelmingly, and so did Rashida Tlaib, and the people who were like raising money to fund their opponents. A lot of most of that money went wasted. So like is that taking away some of the power of this charge of like anti-Semitism? Like, are we going to keep seeing more of this when people criticize Israel to them being called anti-Semites, or is that starting to shift now? What do you think about that?
I mean, I certainly don't see any diminishment in the use of the tactic. In fact, I see it escalating. Um, the uh, the use of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, which the person Ken Stern, who actually was the lead writer of that definition, has said should not be used to limit speech, to lay down rules, certainly to not to criminalize criticism of Israel. Um, that definition is being used and it's being adopted all over. It's being adopted in educational institutions. It's being adopted on governmental institutions. And it's dangerous. It does conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism in the examples that it sets forth. I also think the definition is not very well developed, but and that is giving people a tool to speak out. And as we can see across the United States, there are many municipalities that are passing laws that equate the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel with anti-Semitism, and are actually making passing laws that state that in order to get a state contract, for example, you would have to sign a letter promising not to engage in BDS against Israel. So essentially limiting your own speech. And passing laws that say the state cannot do business with any business that supports the BDS movement. So no, I don't see this diminishing. I see the use of this tactic accelerating because there isn't much else to do. The only real way supporters of Israeli policy at this stage can reinforce that support is through this tactic, because people are more and more are seeing more and more what Israel is doing. The fact that Israel is not really trying to reach an accommodation with the Palestinians. Israel has already, the Netanyahu government has made it clear they are not interested in a two-state solution. Netanyahu's party, the Likud, which continues to be the largest party in Israel, that's part of their platform, that there will be no Palestinian state. So, let alone any other resolution of secular democratic or binational state. All of these things are things that Israel opposes. Essentially, Israel is trying to continue the occupation in perpetuity. So people are seeing that, and they're seeing the effects on the ground more and more, and are questioning why is it we're allowing Israel to do this, because it really doesn't serve any positive purpose. So it's very, very difficult then to make the argument to support those policies. So instead, you make the argument that opposition to Israel is actually opposition to Israel's existence and to the existence of Jewish people and to the self-determination of Jewish people. And so therefore it is anti-Semitic. So no, I don't see it diminishing. And I still, unfortunately, see it being effective, largely because supporters of Palestinian rights have not yet, I think we're working on it, but have not yet been able to mount a really effective systemic defense against it.
Okay, thanks. So I'll ask a question. I'll kick it off to one of our Palestine-Israel Working Group members, Pat, to ask a question, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So if people listening right now, if they have questions, they could use their raise hand feature on Zoom, and I can call on them to ask their question, or they could put their question in the chat, and I'll keep an eye out for it if you want me to read it out. Okay, so Mitchell, the question I have for you to follow up on something you were saying just now, when we here at Mass Peace Action, when we lobby Congress on this issue about Palestine and Israel, even now, still in 2021, we're getting like this almost like reflexive response about, hey, I support the two-state solution. And even though, as you mentioned, like it's so clear for all of us to see that Israel under the Netanyahu government, they're not interested in a two-state solution. So I guess the question for you is strategically, like for those of us who want to see an end to the occupation in Israel and Palestine, or at least an end for the US support of the occupation, what do you think is the primary strategy to follow? Should we continue lobbying Congress? Are you more encouraged by these divestment campaigns on campuses? Is it some mixture of all of the above, or what do you think the primary strategy should be here? Should we argue with Congress about this two-state solution thing, or like, so what do you think?
I think debates on, the sort of, 50,000 feet in the air looking down questions are not questions for lobbying. They are important questions for public discourse, for public debate, and that affects Congress, indirectly, and that can be important too. But you have to look at, if you're going to talk to your member of Congress, you have to look and come with an ask them to do something. You want them to do a thing, and for the most part, with just a few exceptions in Congress, they're going to need to follow something that's, some kind of current event, or something that some initiative that another member has already put forth and has gathered some momentum. Occasionally there are bills in Congress that are worth supporting. And I think if you're going to lobby, that is probably the best thing to look out for. Something like was it last year, I believe, or the year before, Betsy McCollum from Minnesota had a great bill that gathered some support, that would have required reporting about incidents of imprisoning Palestinian children and their treatment by the Israeli authorities. That would have been, that could have been important. Or the latest, and you can look at, incidentally, the Foundation for Middle East Peace does a weekly legislative roundup that if you subscribe to that, you'll know what bills are in Congress, and that the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, is pushing, so you'll know what to call your Congress and, for the most part, tell them to oppose. That kind of thing can be really useful. One of the problems is congressional offices really don't hear much from people who support Palestinian rights, whereas people who support Israeli policies are on the phone and in their offices and writing them letters all day, every day. So that actually is more important than a lot of people think it is. It can also be useful to, if you think you have a member who might be willing to take the lead on something like a letter, for example, just to pull out an idea, a letter supporting the International Criminal Court. Doesn't have to actually say anything about Israel and Palestine, just in general supporting the International Criminal Court and saying that the United States should join it because it upholds international law, and that's a good thing. Sometimes in politics, something that doesn't actually directly target the issue can have an enormous impact. If something like that got congressional support, I don't think it would right now, so I'm not suggesting that specifically, but I'm just using it as a sort of illustration. Something like that actually got support in Congress, it would really open some eyes in Israel, as well as in some other places, and would really be a boost toward a system of international law. So, it's things like that. I think it's really, really important in general to be specific. If your congressperson can answer, I support a two-state solution to whatever you're coming with, then yeah, you're coming with the wrong thing, because Congress itself, foreign policy, and certainly the day-to-day of foreign policy and the day-to-day of diplomacy, that's not what Congress does. That's the executive branch. That's the president, that's the State Department, and you can go to them and try and get bigger policy changes. But if you're going to Congress, it's really much more about think about what's happening right now, look at where something can be said, because the role Congress plays here is largely one of expressing this sort of blanket permanent support for Israel. Like anything Israel does is going to be just okay with us, no matter how much it hurts the Palestinians. And if they started sending a different message, that is how Congress could most profoundly, I think, affect American diplomacy.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that advice. We're going to pay close attention to that. I'm just going to take this opportunity to plug in Mass Peace Action along with lobbying Congress. We also work at the state legislature here in the state of Massachusetts. We introduced 7 bills to the state legislature in this cycle. One of them is titled a Travel Conflict of Interest Bill. And so what that bill is doing is there's all these restrictions for lobbyists to give gifts to state legislatures, but there's a loophole for travel. And that loophole has been used to pay for state legislatures to go on these propaganda trips to Israel. So we introduced a bill to kind of close that loophole. In a second, I'll share information about that bill in the chat. So if people want to contact their local state legislator to ask them to co-sponsor the bill, they can do so. All right, next up, I want to pass the floor to Pat Westwater-Jong. She's a member of our Palestine-Israel Working Group. And Mitchell, you mentioned how important it is to reach out to our members of Congress. Pat is one of the people who is like most active on that front in our group. So Pat, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Nice for you to be here, Mitchell, this evening. Thank you so much for coming. I have actually choosing questions here, and I've chosen a question about the Iran deal, or the JCPOA, and the role progressives played in 2015 and that they're playing now or aren't. You noted in your book that in 2015, at that time, Representative Bonner made the, quote, unprecedented decision to invite the Israeli prime minister to talk to Congress about the JCPOA, or the Iran deal, without first informing the White House to ensure that, quote, there was no interference, unquote, from the administration. Some suggested this move may have been unconstitutional. And you note that it is normal and healthy for Congress and the White House to clash over foreign policy, but it is not normal, however, for opposition lawmakers and a foreign leader to publicly work hand in hand to undermine the diplomatic efforts of a sitting US president. And then you stated rather generously, I think, this does not mean Republicans were actively trying to undermine America's interests on behalf of Israel. They saw them as one and the same. But given the choice between Netanyahu and Obama, as Salatin wrote, it is pretty clear whom the Republicans felt more loyal to. And right now we are in a somewhat parallel situation, trying to sign back onto the JCPOA. And yet I think the first time around, progressives made a big push in trying to played a big role in getting that passed. So I'm wondering if you can describe the process by which members of Congress came to support the JCPOA in 2015 and compare that to what is happening now regarding the US signing back onto this deal with Iran, and perhaps highlight things that were done, could be done now, perhaps aren't being done. Thank you.
Yeah, it's actually a really important question that you're raising. So in 2015, just to tell you where I was at the time, I was the vice president for the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and we were part of what came to be called by the sort of neoconservative hawks as the echo chamber. We were working with a number of other groups in Washington to coordinate plan to support the Obama administration's efforts to bring the Iran nuclear deal into being. And it was a tight fight. It was a very, very difficult undertaking at that time, because much of the Senate, and I'm talking now about Democrats, were opposed to coming up with this deal with Iran. Partially, that was due to the fact that Israel and Saudi Arabia were bitterly opposed to this initiative. And part of it was also due to decades of enmity with Iran. The thing that was most frankly different then from now, and I'm really quite disappointed by this fact, is that it was one of the rare occasions, certainly in my career and my life, that we were actually working with an existing administration. It was, I think Barack Obama's foreign policy left a lot to be desired, but when it came to the Iran deal, that was a good initiative. And it was a very, very good idea. And what we needed to do was to support the Barack Obama administration. Now, what we're needing to do is push Joe Biden, because Biden is dragging his feet on this, despite a campaign promise where he said that he was going to get us right back into the JCPOA. I wouldn't go so far yet as to say that he is reneging on that promise, but he is clearly not pushing hard on Democratic members of the Senate because of his prioritizing of domestic issues right now. Not just COVID-19, but other domestic things. He is just essentially putting foreign policy, including the Iran deal, on the back burner, and it's a terrible mistake, because what he is doing is sending a message to Iran that not only can the United States not be trusted, as Donald Trump proved by just taking the JCPOA and tearing it up, as he said he would, but which completely undermines American diplomacy in all regards, because what it tells the world is that if this president makes an agreement, the next president may just come along and decide, nah, we're not abiding by it. I think that the key point there is that Iran did nothing in violation of this deal until long after the United States had pulled out of it. And when it did move past the deal and do things that were counter to the letter of the JCPOA, it did so in a very measured way that was clearly geared towards trying to create pressure on the U.S. to get back into the deal. Again, because he is sacrificing foreign policy for his domestic agenda, I believe, Biden is not forcefully acting to get back into the JCPOA. He could simply decide to do it, but in order for the sanctions to be lifted, he has to get Congress to go along with him. So he needs Democratic senators to support him. And right now, certainly the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez, is somebody who was always opposed to the Iran deal. And Biden's really not doing anything to push him. In fact, the opposite. He's trying to coddle him because he's afraid. And Menendez has kind of sent signals that he would do this. He is concerned that Menendez will block his appointments. He will block other initiatives. And as we know, with a 50-50 Senate, everything is very, very fragile. So I think what can we do about it? I think the obvious thing of pushing members of Congress is clear, but I think also one of the things that I've been trying to say and convince my colleagues of the need of is that in 2015, many of us went out there in public and talked about, listen, the Iran deal is a really good deal. And once the deal went through and Obama signed it, it became about, about the politics of the deal and trying to stop Trump from backing out of it. But the thread we lost was the deal itself. One of the best selling points that we had for this deal is that it is an insanely good deal for the United States. Iran agreed to things that no other country has ever agreed to in terms of intrusive inspections, in terms of limitations on its nuclear research. These are agreements that other countries, not just nuclear powers, many countries are what we call nuclear breakout states, so that in other words, they have the capability to develop a nuclear weapon within a year or so, if they want to do so. Most of them don't, and most of them have agreed not to under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran is also a signatory to. The measures that Iran agreed to that go beyond that are measures that, frankly, I didn't think when this first came up, 7 or 8 years ago, I didn't think Iran would agree to. We have lost the momentum behind saying this is a really good deal. And I think we need to go back to the basics, go back and actually look at the JCPOA. In fact, I'm working right now on some literature that I'm hoping to get distributed much more widely in the next few weeks, that says, hey, this is a really, really good deal. So many of the people who support the JCPOA publicly start their support by saying, okay, it's not perfect, but, well, yeah, it's not perfect. I mean, no deal is ever perfect, right? But as imperfect deals go, this one's really good for the US side. And it can be good for Iran as well, if we ever actually lived up to the deal. By the way, it's worth noting that the Obama administration also did not live up to our side of the deal. We were supposed to help encourage investment in Iran. That's part of the JCPOA. That's something we agreed to do, never did it. And then Trump came in and, of course, scared the hell out of everybody. It's one thing to say you can invest in Iran and we won't stop you. It's another thing to create the atmosphere where businesses are comfortable making that investment. And that is something that we never did. So I think it is important for us to publicly go out there and say, hey, this is a good deal and we should get back in it for our own interest, not to mention the fact that it'll also avert the possibility of a war in the Persian Gulf, which would be a nightmare for everybody concerned.
Thanks, Mitchell. And thank you, Pat, for that question. All right, next up, I saw that Michael had a question. Michael.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is related, but there's a proposal there called the Tracks for Regional Peace. Apparently, Israel's built a railroad to the Jordan border, and Saudi Arabia's built a railroad to the Jordan border, and they want to finish the railroad in Jordan and then be able to just bypass the whole Straits of Hormuz and all that other area. And I'm wondering if they do complete that railroad, will it lead to any kind of peace as they are talking about? And what could be the larger impact of having Saudi Arabia and Israel working together like that?
Well, so first of all, the idea of alternative routes to shipping out of the Persian Gulf are iffy. It is always difficult to rely on land routes. Things like railroads are easily sabotaged. They can also easily, any of you who, any of you who ever took a train to work on a daily basis know how these things can break down. And if you look and see what just happened with the Suez Canal, those sort of supply chains, you don't want them disrupted. So shipping through the Straits of Hormuz would probably still be a necessity on some level. This isn't a cure-all for that. That being said, also, I would be, whenever you hear about some sort of construction project or business deal or anything like that that is quote unquote for peace, question the name. That's not usually the real goal. It doesn't mean that it can't help. Doesn't mean that it can't be a good thing. It can. But right now, certainly the relationship that the Trump administration was building between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and incidentally, Israel and Saudi Arabia have been in contact for many, many years. clandestinely because the Saudis have not normalized their relations with Israel, but they've been communicating for a long time, and their mutual interest is in combating Iran. So it is not, increasing that cooperation is not necessarily a good thing. What made more sense was the ambition, again, just to go back to the Iran deal, the ambition behind that. And this is, again, I have many criticisms of Barack Obama's foreign policy, but the Iran deal is really an exception and really shows what a US president can do in a positive vein if they really want to. The idea behind that deal was to bring Iran into what Obama referred to as the community of nations. The idea was to get Iran out of the cold so that it is sitting around the table and talking through problems and issues and negotiating. And it's he envisioned a very, decades long process that would, he hoped eventually would lead to some sort of regional peace or at least regional accommodation. The idea was that the relationship primarily between Iran and Saudi Arabia would be mollified, would be calmed down, and dialogue would be open. He had, I don't think, any illusions that they would become fast friends anytime in the foreseeable future, but it is not unreasonable to think that they have mutual concerns that they could work on together, and that relationships could be built, and that the bilateral relations between the two countries could improve to the point where there isn't a constant threat of war. I don't think that's unrealistic if you're thinking long term, and that was exactly the process that he hoped the JCPOA would initiate. So it's things like that, and incidentally, that involved Israel as well. It wasn't just Iran and Saudi Arabia, although that I think is where Obama's focus was, but it would bring Israel in as well. And we can bring this back, and I think it's important to bring this back to the question of Palestine, because if the Palestinian issue is resolved in whatever way, and I want to stress, as Americans, I don't think it's our place to decide what way it should be resolved. So when people talk about two states, one state, to me, that's a discussion for Israelis and Palestinians, not for us. Our job is to make sure that Israelis and Palestinians can talk about that on an equal level, and that productive discussions can happen. But it's not for us to decide how that situation should be resolved. But if it was resolved, I mean, all of these problems become much easier to deal with. They don't go away. When the Israeli right says, everybody says Israel's the reason for all of this trouble in the Middle East, that is not true. They're right. That people who say that are dead wrong. Israel is not the cause of all the problems in the Middle East, but Israel makes all the problems in the Middle East harder to solve. Because of the close relationship between Israel and the West. It complicates almost everything. And, if we look just at the conflicts between Iran and Saudi Arabia, it's a really great example. You take, if Palestinian liberation has been achieved and Palestinian rights have been restored, the United States is much more capable of working with the various actors in the Persian Gulf. It frees up so many different things, and it removes from Iran a lot of their own insecurity. Their support, whether you believe it's sincere or not, their support of the Palestinian cause is what causes their deep enmity with Israel, and therefore a lot of their own insecurity. It makes everything so much easier to deal with.
Great. Thanks, Mitchell. Yeah, I mean, regardless of how the stateless Palestinians and Israel resolve their situation, at the very least, the U.S. should not be sending billions and billions upon dollars in military aid to Israel. Okay, I think we have time for one more question for tonight before we wrap up the program. So I'll pass the floor back over to Pat to ask the last question of the evening. Pat.
Okay, thanks. There are many areas. Your book is full of exceptions that we make for the state of Israel that are not helpful to us and to the world. And you've already talked about several of them. So I'm wondering, of all the ones you have not yet spoken about, if you can tell us what you think, in your opinion, are the most dangerous ramifications of this exception that we make for Israel, where we do not criticize actions that they take, or support that we give them. And perhaps then what we might do about it.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, I think in a sense, I would kind of point the question in a somewhat different direction, because the exceptions that we make for Israel are in some way an outgrowth of the entire American approach to foreign policy, which you can characterize as imperialistic. You can characterize it as a sort of, you know, the way superpowers behave, you know, different sort of terminology that you can use. But everything we do, you know, we can see, for example, just in the last couple of days, the Biden administration has renewed its tough talk about China, because China has made a deal with Iran. And Biden sort of extended that criticism to China's whole Belton Road initiative. Well, China is actually going around the world trying, yes, to build alliances, to strengthen their relationships with many other countries, and they're doing it by helping those other countries build infrastructure. They're not doing it out of charity. They're doing it, yes, to strengthen their presence around the world, to strengthen their relationships with many of the developing countries around the world, and to make them, you know, put themselves at the head of a global bloc of countries that you know would be a sort of, in a sense, imperial presence. That's how China's doing it. We've chosen to do it with military bases. We do something very similar. We just build military bases all over the place instead of building infrastructure. When we do build infrastructure, it's always based on a business investment, and very often it's exploitative of the countries that we are working with. So there is these two different models. When we look at why we make an exception for Israel, Israel's role in geopolitics and in U.S. geostrategic thinking is pretty central. You know, between intelligence, between the disproportionately dynamic nature of its economy and its deep partnership with many American corporations, you know, the U.S. has a lot of investment in Israel. The U.S. depends, in a sense, on Israel, though not nearly as much as Israel depends on the United States. But there is this very, very close alliance, and there's also various reasons of, you know, sort of, I don't want to say exactly propaganda, but there's a certain worldview that our partnership with Israel sort of, you know, helps to construct. So there's all sorts of different ways in which this happens, and it creates a situation where Israel can literally get away with murder, because even more than the United States, because it is under the protection of the superpower, and the superpower essentially protects it in the diplomatic and international business field from any consequences of for its actions, that Israel can essentially do what it wants within the limits of, it doesn't want to push its relationship with the United States too far. But it's constantly pushing that envelope a little further and further to see where those boundaries are. So it's that whole, it really comes down to an absence of prioritizing human rights. The fact of the matter is that when U.S. policymakers are looking at Israel on the one hand and Palestinians on the other, they see Israel offers a lot. Israel gives material benefits to the United States in you know, all the ways I just mentioned. Palestinians offer nothing. In fact, they offer a threat, not a threat to anyone's security, certainly, not a threat really to anyone's interests in the sense of like business or military. But imagine for a moment the reaction of the world if Palestinians actually would win their freedom, would win their rights, would win their liberation. It completely undermines the whole way the United States goes about our business, because we don't base our policies in the world on human rights. Our allies, in places like Egypt, in places like Saudi Arabia, in places like the United Arab Emirates, are not the nicest people in the world. Those governments are autocratic and very, very harsh, and we support them because, as some have put it, they are bastards. That whole approach gets undermined when people, through determination and will, overcome one of our allies, one of our closest allies, and achieve their own rights. And it inspires lots of other people. As we saw, we saw what happened with the Arab Spring. We saw how many people, even though it was put down very harshly, but we saw how many people got inspired by a little bit of success, even if those successes were later reversed. If the Palestinians were similarly victorious, there would be great inspiration. So I don't think that it's necessarily the case that a lot of American leaders are thinking we must not allow the Palestinians to win. But I think it is the case that American elites look at the Palestinians and say, okay, I mean, we're not particularly motivated to help them win, whereas we are motivated to help our friends in Israel. And I think fundamentally, that is exactly the fight that progressives should be having. It's the same fight we have on domestic issues. It's the same fight we have when we say Black Lives Matter. That's the same principle. And we should be applying that to our fights in foreign policy. And so, I mean, that's really, when you get down to it, why I do what I do. So.
Great. Thanks, Mitchell, for that. And thank you, Pat, for that question. All right, so we're past 8, so we're gonna start wrapping this program up. Once again, the name of the book is Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics in the US. Mitchell, I know some of our members bought the book in preparation for this event. For everyone else, if you are interested in tonight's discussion and want to read more, please do go out and purchase the book. Thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Mitchell, for being with us tonight. If people want to follow up on your work, where can they find you?
You can find me through my website at rethinkingforeignpolicy.org, rethinkingforeignpolicy, all one word, .org. You can also contact me through there. You can follow me on Twitter at MJ Plitnick. You can keep up with all of my writing through my blog, as well as some of the latest actions around things. And you can also find me at, I do a weekly or bi-weekly newsletter at Substack at mitchellplitnick.substack.com.
Great. So I'll, to everyone on this call right now and everyone who registered for this event, I'll send them a follow-up email tomorrow. It'll include the video recording of this event, and I'll include some of those links you just mentioned. So everyone, do feel free to reach out to me for any reason. Again, we have a Palestine-Israel working group where we discuss these issues. We engage in congressional lobbying. We do all sorts of activities. So if anyone, like I mentioned earlier, we introduced a bill to the state legislature to address an aspect of this, this dynamic. So if anyone's interested, feel free to reach out to me. And again, I'll be sending up a follow-up email about this tomorrow. Mitchell, are there any last closing words you want to leave us with?
Just really quickly, I actually noticed someone in the chat ask about a way to buy the book that's not through Amazon. If you go to bookshop.org, you can pretty much buy any book you could buy on Amazon through that, and it supports local independent booksellers. So I strongly recommend that. Otherwise, yeah, no, thanks. I would just thank everyone for your thoughtful questions and your listening to me tonight.
Well, thanks again, Mitchell, so much for joining us. And thank you everyone for being with us as well tonight. So on that note, everyone, please have a great night.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much.
Thanks, everyone.
You.
Thank you.